Hey class, so this week we're going to be covering Module 2, and I'm going to just jump right in and get to business here. So at the very top I have a note about comics. Because this is where most superheroes come from, I'm going to be referring to a lot of the comics. In addition to your book for the class, which is Grant Morrison's Super Gods, which I want you to be reading, and he'll actually be referring to a lot of these too, the original comics that these heroes first appeared in, and then how that ties into the movies that we're talking about in the class too. So I don't always expect you folks to be able to read these comics, but they're there. And so I will leave links for you folks to access them if you want. Whenever they're free, I want you folks to definitely read them. Whenever they cost money, I'm not going to ask you, say you have to do it, but I will make it optional for you folks because it can get pricey after a while, just like collecting comic books was in the first place. But now you can do it in a digital format. So when I refer to this stuff, that's why. Some of the history names and terminology that I want you folks to know, because I'll be referring to it in the text, and Grant Morrison will be referring to it as well, are the Golden Age. So we start with the Golden Age of comics, and that's where Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman come from, Captain America as well. It's the first real time when comics became popular, and then these superheroes became really popular as well. And it lasted from 1938 to 1950. Some of those characters died off or were phased out, only to come back later. The Silver Age from 1956 to 1970. Notice there's no continuity here, so one ends in 1950, and then it's really 6 years before the Golden Age, or the Golden Age ended to where the Silver Age started. And that's partly because of the fact that comics kind of pushed superheroes to the side and moved towards romance and horror comics. So that's kind of what was happening for about 6 years there. The Silver Age brought in, it was the rise of Marvel, really. It was kind of a smaller player earlier on during the Golden Age, and Stan Lee really kind of came to prominence as the editor over there. And Jack Kirby, who was around during the Golden Age, a lot of his best stuff really came out during the Silver Age. And DC ended up creating the Flash. The Justice Society becomes the Justice League. And then also the Comics Code was passed, which very much like the Hollywood production code, like completely stifled any kind of creativity and also contributed to kind of an air of both sexism and racism in a lot of the comics, because there were just a lot of things you couldn't do, so that exclusion ends up creating that particular situation. So if you ever wondered why comic books were the way they are and old movies are the way they are, it's because some well-meaning citizens decided that in order to prevent the nation's morality from being corrupted, they needed to create a code, which ended up corrupting everyone's morality in a totally different way. Oh well. And then we have the Bronze Age from 1970 to 1985. I believe Grant Morrison refers to this as the Dark Age, and this is where the X-Men really first become really relevant. They existed before that, but their time was really the Bronze Age, where people really started to notice them. And there were some good and bad attempts. We'll get to this because the Comics Code was kind of being phased out. That there were some attempts at representation, and some of them were really good, some of them not so good. We'll talk about that when we move forward there. And then we move into the modern age, which is 1985 to the present. This is when Frank Miller took over Batman, created the Dark Knight series. We have Alan Moore's, Dave Gibbons' The Watchmen, really kind of modernized and took comics in a different direction. And this is where a lot of the stories for the movie comics that we're watching, or the movies from comics, where they come from. And so the rise of the independents really pushed the major comic companies to make newer and bolder stories, and they started hiring a lot of those folks, people like Grant Morrison and Mark Millar. And Mark Millar, we'll talk about him a lot more because the whole Avengers story cycle really kicks off with some of his stuff. Same thing with Captain America's as well. So we'll talk about that later. But I will be referring to this stuff throughout the class, and I just want to make sure you folks understand where we're coming from when we talk about the comics tie-in to a lot of these characters. So this week we're talking about Superman, the first superhero. Not really. there were other superheroes before, but he's the first one that really kind of kicked off the golden age of comics. We had the Phantom before that, but he was just like a rich guy who wore a costume, lived on an island. Superman had like real, genuine superpowers, wore tights. Those are the kind of the rules. Batman counts too. When we get to Batman next week, I'll talk about why he's a superhero, even though he doesn't really seem to have superpowers. Okay, I'm going to use that interchangeably in this class because some of these costumed heroes, they still have powers, even though they don't really have them, and it's pretty logical. So Superman first showed up in Action Comics. It took him a little while before he had his first standalone series. And Action Comics 1 was a spin-off of Detective Comics. Get it? Detective Comics, DC. That was where he first appeared. Action Comics, and that run continued for a few years there. 1938 kind of changed everything. He was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They sold the rights to their character for $130. And if you're wondering how and why that happened, it was before Superman really took off. So they'd been pushing this idea to any comic publisher that would listen. And finally, somebody said, Detective Comics said, yeah, we'll take this guy. Here's $130. They're like, yay, we can finally eat. But then they spent their entire careers trying to get the money back that Superman earned. And they got some of it back, but it was a lifelong battle for those guys. And they did not live great, fantastic lives. They were poor for most of their lives and, kind of died in relative obscurity. That's comics for you right there. Kind of sad. So initially, Superman was a little different from the way we see him now. He was not absolutely all powerful. He was strong. He could leap very high. That whole leaping is building in a single bound. He could run as fast as a freight train, things like that. But he wasn't completely invincible. You could probably kill him if they found someone who could, but they didn't. And his laser vision and freezing breath and ability to fly around the world numerous times to change time and things like that, he didn't have those yet. So over time, his powers increased. Of course, they found kryptonite later, so they could, hurt him with that and things like that. But one thing that has been constant with Superman is his struggle. So even though he is this powerful being, he struggles with his position being an alien and an orphan, dropped off on Earth and never really fitting in. And he wants to use his powers to help people, but at the same time, people are afraid of him because he has powers. Anytime he does something that's just mildly wrong or inconvenient for anyone, suddenly he's a monster. So that's something that's always a part of Superman's being. And then we also have this idea of Clark Kent versus Superman, and Clark Kent is his human alter ego. That was the name that his adoptive parents called him. And Clark Kent wears glasses. Does anyone see through that disguise? Apparently not. But he's like the wimpiest guy ever. And even Lois is totally frustrated with him because he's just so afraid of showing his powers off that he lets her get pawed at by these gangsters in the very first episode of Action Comics, and she's like totally frustrated, forget it. And then she sees Superman. It's like, now this is a guy, this is a man right here, I like him. So there's always this tension. Clark Kent is superhumanly weak, Superman superhumanly powerful, and they're still both outsiders no matter how you shake it. So that's a bit of a problem for Superman. One thing I want to point out is Siegel and Shuster, those struggles that they face throughout their lives. This gets paralleled really nicely in a Michael Chabon novel called The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay. So it's a story about these other poor comic book creators who, lose control of their character. But that one, it's kind of a combination between a story of the writers and then also a story of the character. So kind of a cool parallel, but definitely a pattern on definitely patterned after Siegel and Shuster and their kind of travails throughout their lives. So this week's film is Man of Steel, and directed by Zack Snyder, as a lot of you folks know. It's also written by David S. Goyer, whose fingerprints are all over the DC cinematic universe. If you look, you'll see his name in the writing credits all over the place. So this is the first entry into the DC Comics attempt at a cinematic universe, which is kind of a mixed bag in my personal opinion. This film itself is pretty good. We definitely have Wonder Woman. And then we have a lot of other films that are kind of not entirely fitting together with this. So we'll see what happens with the future with this. And I think part of the problem with that is that as good as Zack Snyder is, without having somebody to oversee the whole process like we have at Marvel, and Kevin Feige, that really allowed that whole thing to come together. And I think a lot of personalities end up clashing with the DC extended universe, and that's what causes kind of the disparate parts of that. And then the movies, like Dawn of Justice, which was okay, but kind of fell apart towards the end. And then, of course, there's Justice League as well. Who knows what will happen with the Snyder Cut? If that will suddenly be fantastic, I don't know. I went to go see the movie, and it was disappointing, to say the very least. Okay. On from that, this movie is an excellent movie, and it's a good one for us to start with, and definitely to get into the Superman lore. The comic origin of this borrows from 4 main comics, and they're ones you can look for. One is the Superman, the Man of Steel storyline, the Supergirl saga, Superman Last Son, and Superman Earth One, which were issued between 1986 and 2010. So if you want to look for where they got a lot of the atmosphere and then some of the storylines for this version of the origin story of Man of Steel, this is where you can find a lot of that stuff. There's also, of course, is Superman 2 from 1980, which I absolutely loved as a kid, and that has General Zod and his henchpersons, and of course, has the fantastic Terrence Stamp as Zod, which is really, really hard to beat. Although the Zod in this movie is perfectly fine and evil as well. So this movie kind of seamlessly incorporates a lot of these elements into a very dark, very brooding, as I like to say, self-important package, but a lot of superhero movies need to be that way. So I've included some links to these so you folks can get into those. So the synopsis for this film: with the destruction of his planet imminent, Kryptonian technocrat Jor-El sends off his infant son in a space crib, which crash lands on Earth. And of course, Krypton explodes after that and everybody dies, you would think. And then the space baby gets adopted by the Kent family. They name him Clark, try to raise him as a normal child. But because he isn't normal and is trying to hide this, he struggles with this, suffers with his identity and his place in this world. Should he become Superman, or should he try to be a normal guy and help out however he can? And then, of course, when a new alien threat arrives on Earth, possibly coming from his old home planet, Clark Kent has to step up, put on his S-suit, and protect his adopted world and people from certain destruction.